Poor Waitress adopts Billionaire's abandoned father, his son, returns years later and regrets every. What if the most generous act of kindness came from someone who had the least to give? Elena wiped down the last table at Murphy's Diner as the autumn rain drummed against the windows. At 35, she'd been serving coffee and comfort to strangers for over a decade, her warm smile never fading despite the ache in her feet and the constant worry about next month's rent. That's when she noticed him. An elderly gentleman sitting alone in the corner booth, his expensive suit wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, clutching a small suitcase like it held his entire world. His eyes, clouded with confusion, searched the empty diner as if looking for someone who would never come. "Arthur," he'd whispered when she approached, his voice trembling with a dignity that poverty couldn't steal. He'd been waiting there for 3 hours, abandoned by the one person he thought would never leave him behind. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Elena had always believed that kindness was like a candle. It cost nothing to share its light. She'd learned this from her grandmother, who'd raised her in this same small Pennsylvania town after her parents died. Now, looking at Arthur's bewildered face, she recognized the same lost expression she'd seen in her own mirror years ago. She sat across from him, her shift long over, and listened as his story unfolded in broken fragments. Arthur had built a construction empire from nothing, working 18-hour days to provide for his son, Jonathan. He'd sacrificed everything, his health, his friendships, even time with his late wife, to ensure Jonathan would never know hardship. When dementia began stealing pieces of his memory, Arthur had moved in with his son, believing their bond was unbreakable. Jonathan's penthouse overlooking the city had become Arthur's prison, where expensive caregivers treated him like an inconvenience and his son avoided him like a guilty secret. "He brought me here this morning," Arthur explained, his hands shaking as Elena refilled his coffee cup. "Said he'd be right back. Just needed to make a quick business call." The old man's voice carried no anger, only the devastating acceptance of a heart that had been broken by the person it loved most. Elena's own apartment was barely large enough for one person, her savings account perpetually hovering near zero. She worked double shifts just to cover basic expenses, often choosing between groceries and heating bills. Taking in Arthur seemed impossible. Yet, as she watched him struggle to remember his son's phone number, she knew she couldn't walk away. Some decisions aren't made with logic, they're made with the heart, and her heart was breaking for this forgotten father. When she offered Arthur her couch for the night, she expected him to refuse. Instead, tears rolled down his weathered cheeks as he nodded gratefully. That night, as she listened to him mumble in his sleep about teaching Jonathan to ride a bicycle, Elena realized she wasn't just helping a stranger. She was saving a piece of herself, the part that believed in the power of human connection, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. 3 weeks passed before Jonathan even reported his father missing. Elena discovered this when a private investigator knocked on her door, hired not out of love but from legal obligation. Arthur's disappearance had become a potential liability, something that could damage Jonathan's carefully crafted public image. The investigator was cold, efficient, treating Arthur like lost property rather than a human being. Elena had spent those weeks watching Arthur slowly bloom in her tiny apartment. Away from the sterile luxury of his son's home, he remembered things: how to make his late wife's famous apple pie, the songs he used to sing while building tree houses, the stories he'd told Jonathan during bedtime. Her small space became filled with his gentle laughter and the smell of cinnamon from his afternoon baking sessions. They'd developed routines: morning coffee while watching the sunrise, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, where Arthur would point out architectural details from buildings he'd helped construct decades ago, but the investigators' visit shattered their peaceful existence. Arthur's face crumpled as the reality hit him. Jonathan wasn't looking for his father out of love. He was looking for him to avoid embarrassment. Elena watched helplessly as Arthur retreated into himself, the progress they'd made dissolving like sugar in bitter coffee. "Maybe I should go back," Arthur whispered that evening, staring at his reflection in Elena's bathroom mirror. "I'm just a burden now." Elena found him packing his small suitcase, the same one he'd clutched that first night at the diner. Her heart broke watching this dignified man try to fold his few belongings with trembling hands, accepting rejection from the son he'd given everything to create. She knelt beside him, gently placing her hands over his. "You're not a burden, Arthur. You're family." The word hung between them like a bridge spanning years of loneliness. Arthur had given his biological son everything, only to be discarded when caregiving became inconvenient. Elena had nothing material to offer, yet she was willing to share her whole world. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. That night, Arthur made a decision that would change everything. He asked Elena to help him write a letter, not to Jonathan, but to his lawyer. He wanted to ensure that his modest estate would go to someone who understood the true value of love over money. 6 months later, Elena received a phone call that made her blood run cold. Jonathan's voice, sharp with barely contained fury, demanded she return his father immediately. Arthur's lawyer had informed him about the will changes, and suddenly, the son who couldn't be bothered to visit became intensely interested in his father's whereabouts. The inheritance wasn't massive by Jonathan's standards, but it represented something more valuable: Arthur's final statement about where his love truly belonged. Elena felt Arthur's entire body tense as she relayed the conversation. The old man who'd found such joy in their simple life suddenly looked fragile again, the weight of family betrayal settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He'd spent months believing that maybe, just maybe, his son's absence was due to business pressures rather than callous indifference. Now the truth stood naked before him. "He doesn't want me," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the devastating clarity that sometimes comes with memory loss, when the fog lifts just enough to reveal painful truths. "He wants what I might leave behind." Elena had never felt such protective rage. She'd watched Arthur transform from a broken, confused old man into someone who smiled while teaching her to make proper pancakes, who remembered every detail about her late grandmother when she shared old photographs, who waited by the window each evening for her return from work like she was the most important person in his world. How could Jonathan not see what she saw? A man whose love was vast enough to forgive even the deepest wounds. The crisis deepened when Jonathan arrived unannounced, accompanied by a social worker and legal documents claiming Elena was taking advantage of a mentally incompetent elderly man. Arthur hid in Elena's bedroom while she faced down his son in her tiny living room. Jonathan was everything she'd imagined: expensive suit, cold eyes, the kind of practiced charm that could convince anyone he was the victim in this situation. "You're manipulating a sick old man," Jonathan accused, his voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. "I'm his family." Elena looked at this stranger who shared Arthur's eyes but none of his warmth, and realized that biology doesn't automatically create bonds. Love does that. Commitment does that. Showing up when it's difficult does that. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Arthur emerged from the bedroom then, his back straight despite his age, and faced the son who'd abandoned him with a dignity that made Elena's heart swell with fierce pride. "I know who you are," Arthur said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. For a moment his memories aligned perfectly, and he saw Jonathan not as the successful businessman who'd discarded him, but as the little boy who used to climb into his lap during thunderstorms. "You're my son, and I failed you." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He'd prepared for anger, for accusations, for the senile ramblings of a deteriorating mind. He hadn't prepared for forgiveness from the man he'd abandoned in a diner 6 months ago. Arthur stepped closer, and Elena watched 30 years of buried guilt crash over Jonathan's face. "I worked so hard to give you everything," Arthur continued, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. "Money, education, opportunities. But I forgot to give you the most important thing. Time to learn how to love someone when it's inconvenient." Jonathan's carefully constructed facade began to crack. He looked around Elena's modest apartment, at the photos of Arthur helping her tend a small herb garden, at the half-finished wooden birdhouse they'd been building together, at the evidence of a life filled with small joys he'd never bothered to notice. His father, who'd lived in luxury for months in Jonathan's penthouse, looked healthier and happier than he had in years. "Dad," Jonathan whispered, the word catching in his throat like a confession. I thought you'd be better with professional care. I thought I was protecting you." Arthur reached out and took his son's hands, the same hands he'd taught to hold a hammer, to tie shoelaces, to write his name. "You were protecting yourself, son. And I understand. I wasn't an easy father to love." Elena watched this reunion with tears streaming down her face, understanding that love sometimes means stepping aside. She began to move toward the kitchen, giving them space, but Arthur's gentle voice stopped her. "Elena stays," he said firmly. "She's family too now." Jonathan looked at this waitress who'd given his father what money couldn't buy: dignity, purpose, and unconditional acceptance. The shame in his eyes was profound, but so was something else. A glimmer of hope that maybe it wasn't too late to learn what his father was trying to teach him. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. The healing wouldn't happen overnight, but in that small apartment, 3 broken people began to understand that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. 2 years later, Elena still worked at Murphy's Diner, but now she came home to a house instead of a cramped apartment. Jonathan had insisted on buying her a modest 2-story home with a garden where Arthur could grow the tomatoes he'd always talked about. It wasn't charity. It was gratitude, and the difference mattered to all of them. Arthur's memory continued to fade, but his capacity for love seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. He'd forgotten Jonathan's rejection but remembered their Sunday dinners, their shared projects, the way his son now listened to his stories instead of checking his phone. Jonathan visited every weekend, sometimes staying for days, learning to find joy in simple moments he'd once dismissed as waste of time. Elena had become the bridge between father and son, helping them rebuild what pride and misplaced priorities had nearly destroyed. She'd taught Jonathan that love wasn't about providing expensive care, it was about being present when someone needed you to see them as valuable. Arthur had taught them both that forgiveness wasn't a weakness but a gift you give yourself. On Arthur's 80th birthday, they gathered in Elena's garden while he struggled to blow out candles he couldn't quite remember the significance of. But when he looked around at the faces surrounding him, Elena's warm smile, Jonathan's patient presence, even the neighbor children who'd grown to love his rambling stories, his eyes lit up with recognition of something more important than memory: belonging. "I don't remember everything," Arthur said, his voice soft with contentment. "But I remember feeling loved." Jonathan knelt beside his father's chair, finally understanding what he'd almost lost forever. "Dad, I'm sorry I forgot how to be your son. Thank you for not forgetting how to be my father." Elena wiped away tears as she watched them embrace, thinking about how life's greatest gifts often come disguised as inconveniences. She'd thought she was rescuing Arthur that rainy night at the diner, but he'd rescued something in her too: the belief that kindness creates its own miracles. Arthur passed away peacefully the following spring, surrounded by the 2 people who'd learned to love him without conditions. His final words weren't about regret or missed opportunities, but about gratitude for finding his way home to love before it was too late. At his funeral, Jonathan stood before a room filled with Elena's friends, neighbors who'd become Arthur's extended family, and co-workers who'd heard countless stories about the old man who'd made their lives brighter. In his eulogy, Jonathan spoke about second chances, about a waitress who'd taught him that wealth without love was just expensive loneliness, and about a father whose greatest gift was showing him it's never too late to choose family over everything else. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, forgiveness, and finding family in unexpected places.